Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, we are going to take a major turn this week. We have been working since the inception of the podcast, really, looking at this question of where did we come from? Are we the product of naturalism? So time, matter, and chance, a Darwinian process to get us essentially from nothing to where we are today. Is that the best answer for how we got here? Or is an intelligent creator the best answer based on the most current scientific knowledge, the direction that we see scientific discovery going, what we know about the journey, what we know about, and I'll be honest, in some cases, 160 some odd year old theories like Darwin's. As we look at these things, what is the best answer? And we address 5 major points through the podcast looking at this. Number 1 was the cosmological argument. Where did the universe come from? Number 2 was the fine-tuning argument, the teleological argument. Number 3 was the argument looking at the creation of life, the formation, the move from the chemical world to the biological world, and what would it actually take to go from no life to the life that we see around us today. The question of consciousness and the question of morality. And as we've looked at these 5 major arguments and these 5 major points, what we've seen is that the best explanation is that of an intelligent creator. Now, you may disagree with that. And obviously, I can't go back into detail on each of these points. There's a whole lot of episodes that we've addressed these issues in. And I would encourage you, rather than just leaving something in the comments or looking back at, I'm going to be honest, scientific theories and scientific evidence is 40, 50, 60 years old. Go back and watch some of those old episodes and go back and look at that and really test these theories. You know, the reason that we're doing this episode today, how much evidence do you need? I'm intrigued by this question because a lot of times I'll see people who are very comfortable looking at this from a naturalistic perspective, and we're trying to keep this journey respectful. We're trying to keep this journey one that we can do together and enjoy each other's company. And a lot of the comments in the comments section are not always nice. But I want to keep this respectful. And what I want to encourage, when we started this podcast, I identified several groups of people this podcast would be directed to. And one of them was people who identified as naturalists or atheists in that arena. As you look at this question, one of the things I want to encourage you of is the question of how much proof is enough. And the funny thing is, what I tend to find is this odd dynamic. Then when it comes to the question of God's existence, that the bar is raised so high that no level of proof is enough. But when it comes to something like Darwin's theory, a neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, despite the discoveries of the last 50, 60 years that have really just devastated Darwin's argument, the current neo-Darwinian philosophy that we see taught in school today, when we look at that, the amount of just acceptance that we have of a 160-year-old theory with no proof is remarkable when we compare that to the other side of this equation of the amount of proof people demand if we're even to allow the possible mention of God into the equation. And what I want to encourage everybody to do, what we're trying to do is not win an argument. What we're trying to do is to find the truth. And I think that's what we all want to do as we look at this. So what I would say respectfully to every person watching this, whether you identify as somebody who is a naturalist, somebody who's an atheist and looks at this and says, there is no reason that we need to look beyond the current science of the day, or somebody who looks at this and says, I just don't know, or somebody who believes in a creator but just needs to answer questions about what's and where's and why's. What we're trying to do in this journey is to find the best answer. And we're trying to get as close as we can to the truth. And that's why we spent so much time walking through this process trying to determine what is the best answer for how we got here. What I want to encourage each one of us to do is a couple of different things. Number 1, we need to reject David Hume's, I'm going to say religion, because really this was more of a faith-based statement out of Hume than it was a statement based on logic or reason or anything else I think that we could look at. Because Hume basically postulated the idea that there was never, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but that there was really never enough evidence to support the idea of the miraculous. And that if we got down to that point, that a miraculous idea would always be the least likely option. And basically what he did was he philosophically ruled God out of the equation. And we see a lot of that going on. I would probably contend, in my opinion, that Richard Dawkins does that by trying to use this regression and argument of, well, if you're going to use God in the argument, you have to say who created God. And we've talked about why that's a self-defeating argument in the past, and I'm not going to rehash all of that. But the problem with Hume's philosophy, the problem with Hume's idea, is pretty straightforward. When you look at something that happened, you have to come up with the best possible answer for what happened, and ruling things out doesn't get you to the best possible answer. If you rule out things and say, well, we need the best possible answer, but we're not going to consider that, we have to look at the most probable answer. And there are going to be times where we look at this and go, the most probable answer is that of intervention by an intelligent third party. And again, we've seen that throughout this journey. So unless we rule God out of bounds, which is not the best way to do this. Again, if the evidence leads us to rule God out of bounds, if the evidence it leads us to a place where we say, well, God is not the best answer for that, that's perfectly fine. But we should never take an answer off the table and say, well, we're never going to consider that as an option. So that's the first thing I would encourage us to do in all of this. We have to look at things and demand an answer. The second thing I would encourage you to do, especially as we start taking this turn and looking at this question of, well, what is the best explanation? If we recognize that the best explanation is that we were created by an intelligent third party, who is that third party? And this is where people tend to change their philosophical stance on evidence a little bit, and that's what I was addressing earlier. When you look at this question, there's not a good reason to put on the table, well, if I'm going to believe in God, then that's going to require a much higher standard of evidence because it's such an important question. I would argue against that for a couple of different reasons. Number one, I don't think anybody does that when we look at the naturalistic side of things. Like I said before, we're very willing to accept, well, time, matter, and chance, and we just don't know how it happened, but it certainly wasn't God. We're willing to accept that as an answer. And again, I would argue, not a good answer either. We don't want to set the bar too low, but there's also no reason to set the bar artificially high. And I would argue in all of this, we don't live our lives that way in any other aspect of our lives. Getting on an airplane, if I'm getting on an airplane flying across the country or around the world, I don't demand to see the pilot's certifications. I don't demand to see his resume or her resume to know how many hours have they flown and what kind of a pilot are they? Are they any good or not? I don't demand to look over Boeing or Airbus's records to see, well, what kind of plane is it that I'm flying on? I assume going into it that a reasonable standard is good enough because I make decisions every day based on that. Before I get on an airplane, I'm going to assume that the plane is safe, that the pilots have an appropriate amount of training, and that they're going to get me safely from point A to point B. And if I'm going to demand an extraordinary amount of evidence in any situation, if I'm going to be consistent, I probably should start there with the airplane. I probably should start with the car that I'm driving every day to work or getting on the highway going 75, 80 miles an hour in something that I could die instantly in. If there's ever going to be a situation where I should demand infinitely more proof and not just assume that everything is okay, I should be starting there. And if I don't live my life that way, getting on an airplane or getting into a car, or for example, when was the last time a physician prescribed you a medication? Do you demand from the pharmacist to see the pharmacist's credentials, to see the drug studies and everything else that went into the medication? Does anybody actually ever read that piece of paper that they give you with all of the black box warnings on the medication that you're taking? It's funny, we see all of these commercials. My wife and I were laughing, the Olympics were on, and I think every other commercial dealt with some sort of a medication, some sort of a pharmaceutical advertisement. You could not go between Olympic events without just being bombarded with pharmaceutical advertisements. And when you listen to the side effects, sometimes we're like, oh my goodness, who would take that? But we don't ever read the black box warnings. We don't ever really dig into the labels or go online and research. Normally speaking, we trust that the physician who prescribed it and the pharmacist who gave it to us and the drug company that developed it, that's good enough. And that there are enough safeguards in place that I don't have to raise the bar that high. So before I take every medication, I don't go to that degree, and I assume that the safeguards in place are enough. I have a reasonable standard of evidence that's okay. So I would encourage us in this debate, when we get to certain places in the debate, we're going to look for the best explanation. And raising the bar unnecessarily high because it's an important question, if we don't live every area of our life like that, is the only reason we're raising the bar is to rule God out of bounds. And I would encourage you to look at that question. Look in your heart and see where you're going with that. I'm not saying we shouldn't ask for any evidence. We absolutely should. And what we're going to do is look at evidence-based answers as we go forward. But ask the question, am I raising the bar too high? Why am I doing that? And is it keeping me from the truth? You know, I always find it interesting. Frank Turek is a great Christian apologist out there. And he has a show out there. He has a website and a weekly podcast and does a bunch of stuff on YouTube, Cross-Examined. And one of the questions he frequently will ask people is, if Christianity was true, would you become a Christian? And it always surprises me the number of people who say, I don't know. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. Because the caveat that he puts in there is, if Christianity was true. Okay, so if Christianity was true, that proposition means that the world was created, that everything was created by a God who looked at creation as his children, who laid down eternity recognizing before he laid the foundations of the earth, that it was going to take him laying down eternity, becoming one of his creation, living with us for 30 some odd years before he would sacrifice himself on the cross to pay the price for our sins and reconcile us back to himself for all eternity. So that's the caveat going in. So if that was true, would you reject that offer or would you accept that offer? And the interesting thing is the number of times people say, yeah, I don't know, or no, I don't think so. And I want you to take a step back from that for a minute, because what I'm asking is, the God of the Bible is the best answer, the best explanation for how we got here. That doesn't mean you can't ask questions. That doesn't mean you can't look at it and go, well, if that's true, I don't understand this, and this. That's perfectly okay. But it also means that at some point we've got to kind of wrap our arms around that and reconcile that. Because if Christianity was true, would you become a Christian? The answer, I'm almost amazed that the answer isn't yes. And so I want you to consider that. And consider that in this journey. If we're looking for the truth, and you look at that and go, absolutely not, I would never accept that. Why? What is that thing that's holding you back? And what I would suggest to you is this. We're going to take a journey where we're building up evidence, and we're looking at evidence, and we're looking at facts. But one of the most important witnesses that we're going to find in all of this is the witness of the Holy Spirit. And what I'm going to suggest to you is this. At any point in this journey, the best thing that I could recommend that you would do is pick up a Bible, open it up, and start reading Matthew chapter 1. A lot of people recommend start reading at the book of John chapter 1. Good with that too. Start reading with an open heart and just ask God to show himself to you, and you will be amazed. He will show up. Now, if you go into it, as with anything else, if you go into it going, fine, I will read the Bible, but I am not going to enjoy this. If you go into it with an attitude, it's going to be a little bit harder for you to hear his voice. It doesn't mean he's not going to show up. But, I mean, let's be honest. In any relationship, if you show up on like a first date and you walk into it and go, hi, I'm here to take you out, and this is going to be terrible. I'm going to go out on a limb and go, that first date is not going to go well. But if you go into it with an open heart and a willingness to go, well, maybe, I don't know, let's see where this goes, you're going to get a lot further on the second one than the first one. I think we all know that to be true. So I'm going to encourage you, if you've got questions, that's okay. Bring them to the table. We're going to look at evidence. We're going to look at all of that stuff. And we're going to talk about that in the next episode, kind of what we're looking to do. But what I want to encourage you to do is come into this with an open heart. Don't raise the bar too high. You don't do that in any other area of your life. Why would you do that in this area? Yes, it's important. So is getting on an airplane. I'd like to get off the airplane the easy way, not the hard way down the chutes. So if you don't, let's not raise the bar any higher than we would in any other area of our life. Let's be honest about this. Let's be open about this. If you've got questions, I encourage this at the end of every episode, and I guess this is a good segue. I'll answer I do my very best to answer any emails that come in at proof2grace@yahoo.com. If you've got questions, please email those. And sometimes I may answer and say, you know what, that's upcoming in an episode, and I really think it would be good if you waited until this and this episode to look at that. I don't always look at comments in the comment section. They tend to be more hateful than they are useful. But if you've got questions, don't be afraid to ask them via email. Bring those questions to the table. And it's more important that you bring those questions to God and trust Him to reach you than it is to bring them to me. But I'm happy to answer those questions as well. I want to encourage you, come into this with an open heart. And let's take this journey together to see if we can recognize, is the God of the Bible the God who created us? What is the best answer to that question, and what is the evidence? And we will begin that journey in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find helpful information on our website at proof2grace.com, and you can find our podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, and of course YouTube. I want to thank you so much for joining me. And once again, you can always email us with questions at proof2grace@yahoo.com. Thank you once again for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.